what is mysticism? Mysticism, of course, is the sense of union with the divine. And there's a sense that the divine dwells within and within all things. The specific aspect of Christian mysticism is the sense that ultimate mystery or divine source that one is one with, that one has a intimate relationship with. There's both a sense of communion, which is that this reality is vast and capable of infinite exploration. So there's always something to long for. There's always a deeper level of relationship. And on the other hand, there's a sense of union. There's a sense of oneness that you start to become and embody aspects of that divine mystery, who Christians, of course, call God. And so there's this sort of hovering between union and communion, between a sense of being fused with the ultimate source, and on the other hand, having a sense of relationship and longing for a deeper union. So there's so many of the mystics talk about this kind of love affair. It's like in a sense, a love affair with a person where there's a sense that there's endless amounts to explore the other person's personality and being. On the other hand, there's moments where you act as one, and there's a sense of union. So there's a sacred third. In any relationship with another human being, the relationship itself has a personality to it. That there's a sacred third. Oftentimes one person will begin to say something and then that the other person was just about to say, right? So that's this kind of sacred third that both are dipping into. It's similar with the Christian mystic and the divine source or God. There's this sense that there's a distinction, but yet there's more of a union. But unlike with a human being, there's an even deeper kind of union in so far as the divine source is right within us, is right within us, speaking to us, and yet there's a sense that we embody that divine source. Christian mysticism, there is a sense that that presence of the ultimate, of divine or of God, is mediated through this sort of filter of the presence of Christ. If we looked at each religious tradition as being a different filter, it gives a different quality to the union. We might think everybody would have a different set of colors, of course, but we might think of Buddhism maybe having a blue filter, sort of cool and observant. We might think of Sufism as having a red filter, passionate. We might think of a Hindu filter as a whole plethora of different colors together. We might think of a Native American filter as green, putting us in touch with the earth around us. I tend to think of the filter that Christian mysticism uses as kind of a radiant gold filter that is warm and glowing, but sort of a calm kind of love. So it's in Christian mysticism, there's a sense of being connected to the heart, and there is a sense of having this kind of calm, radiant love that comes out from the heart and that one feels in the world and within others and within the natural world. A Christian mystic starts by having a devotion to Christ, especially the historical Christ, but gradually Christ as an object starts to disappear, and one begins to be looking out at the world through Christ's eyes, more than looking at Christ. So the Christian mystic tends to talk less about Christ and seek more to embody Christ in their life. Christ becomes like a mirror through which they see their own true self, and then goes within and becomes a kind of gaze out into the world. So in my history, in my early life, I grew up as an evangelical Christian in the Baptist church, and I really loved, so there was a lot of emphasis on the Bible. What I really loved was the aesthetic dimension of it. I really loved the verses that talked about joy. I loved the verses that talked about beauty. There's a verse in the Psalms that says, one thing I have asked of the Lord, to seek the beauty of the Lord. There's another verse where St. Paul talks about, he says, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, think on these things. So I was really attracted to the aesthetic dimension. If you're into the Enneagram, I'm a type 4, so I always had that sense of longing for connection to my ultimate source. And so I grew up having this sort of sense that, so I was overjoyed by the beauty of life, both in nature and in other people, but I also had a sense of being overwhelmed by it, like it was almost too much, and it was a power that was almost too much to bear. I started early, so early on I felt a real connection to people. I felt the sacredness of people, and that there was something there that was really connected to God. I didn't have the language to talk about it real well growing up in the Baptist tradition, but there was a sense that other people were sacred and that they were special. From early on, I appreciated, especially people who had other experiences than I had. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and I had a lot of, in elementary school, there were a lot of African-American students who were my friends. I loved the perspective, especially of the guys that I was friends with, and I kind of wanted to be Black in a way. I loved the sense of being able to express your emotions and the sense of the history. I remember when one of my friends, this would have been in the 60s, brought a Malcolm X book to school. And it was so fascinating because there was a different perspective, and I wanted to know all about it. Similarly, when I was in the Boy Scouts, I remember one of the African-American fathers of one of the Boy Scouts pulled me aside and started telling me about all of the struggles that African-American would go through in our society. I was sensitive and receptive to these sorts of things. Early on, my mother really was interested in Native American culture and what had been done through the years. And so I developed a real interest in Native Americans and wanted to understand what the world was like through their eyes and through their perspective. So people were fascinating to me, but I think I had the sense that I was always less than, that people had more than I did. And so there was there's always this sense of longing, that there was a sense of lack. So with that sense of having difficulty with people, I would go to nature. I would go to the forest and the fields that were around my house in Pennsylvania and spend a lot of time I had collected butterflies, and I remember I got interested in geology, and I found this piece of granite, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world, was the texture, and as I would wash it, the smell of it, and I put a coat of varnish on it because I thought it was so wonderful. But I developed this kind of love relationship with the things around me, the sacredness of people, the sacredness of nature. I got interested in fossils and earth history. So I'd go around, ride my bike around to quarries and collect fossils and some of the gems that I could find. I'd go all by myself, wear a hard hat, and bring my geologist pick. But I had this sense of a love relationship to these various aspects of life and with people. I saw them as sacred. Then when I went to junior high and I encountered more girls, I felt like I didn't know what I could possibly contribute. They seemed like they were so amazing to me. So I would turn red every time I would talk to a girl that I liked. So I'd spend more time in nature, trying to get a sense of center and wondering what I had to offer. So there's a sense of being overwhelmed in a way by the beauty of life and of other people. And so I'd say an attitude of longing kind of predominated for me. So then what happened was my dad would take us on vacations to the West. A certain singer was singing about Colorado, of course, John Denver. And so I got interested in forestry, and he would take us to places in the West, to different national parks and places. And I wanted to live in the West. I felt a special connection there to the wide open spaces and the mountains and the deserts of the West. So I came to Colorado State University, and I came with the express intent of showing how plants and animals and landscapes were able to survive because of these the designs that they had that reflected the beauty and the ingenuity of a creator. So there was a sense of a this kind of mirror that the creation was revealing the perfections of the creator that I wanted to explore. So there was a sense of kind of a distinction between the creator and the creation. However, when I took science classes, the scientists that taught them, they would always say things like, well, I could have designed this plant a lot better so that it wouldn't lose so much water. And everything really isn't all that perfect. And there's a lot of things that you could consider mistakes of evolution. So that kind of burnt me on that approach. However, I would go backpacking and hiking, and I would start to have experiences more of oneness with nature that I couldn't get through the scientific perspective. I had a sense that myself would expand outward, and I would find something of myself in the landscape, and that was the presence of God there in the landscape that I had grown up with in the Baptist faith, but who I was finding in the landscape there. So I switched majors to philosophy and religion then. And I got real interested in exploring these experiences of union that I was having, where I felt like I would expand to become the presence of the mountains or the beauty of a wildflower meadow, that I would feel more attractive inside and being in the presence of that meadow. And I got interested in Eastern religions because they talked a lot about that kind of oneness, especially Hinduism and Buddhism. And then, interestingly, many of the Hindu mystics were talking about Christian mystics. And so I got really interested in delving back into the tradition of origin I grew up with, but from this sort of more non-dual perspective, of this perspective of finding a kind of oneness with the Creator in the natural world and in other people. So one of my professors had been a monk at a Trappist monastery in Snowmass. And he saw that I was getting really interested in the Christian mystical tradition, especially through the writings of Thomas Merton and some others. So he suggested that I go meet this monk who just resigned as abbot of a monastery in Massachusetts and had come to live at St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado. So I went to visit him. This would have been in 1981. And his name was Thomas Keating. He was the guest master. He had resigned. I think he thought he was going to live a life of quiet as a monk there. But my wife and I and our little daughter went to meet him. And it's interesting that, that I immediately recognized that the presence of Christ that we had talked about in our tradition and in the Bible, I was experiencing that presence in this person. So all of the discussions about who was Christ and was he divine or human, or did he become divine, or did he evolve to become divine, or was he originally divine, didn't matter anymore, because I had this person standing right in front of me that embodied this kind of calm and radiant warmth that I was talking about. I got really interested in the contemplative tradition that he was sharing. And I had all kinds of burning questions at the time. And I remember we would take towels and washcloths and bed sheets and pillowcases to this guest house. And we would take them a little tiny armload at a time, and then he would say, oh, I forgot we need more. And we keep going back to the car. And then he'd start pointing out the beauty of the red, the sunlight on the barn and things like that, trying to detach me a little bit from my incredible intensity and these burning questions, and to pay attention to the sacredness that was there all around. So yes, a question.
How old were you?
I was 23. Yes, I was 23.
Please, when you ask a question, speak up so that the online audience can hear you.
All right, yeah, and feel free to interject at any time, please. So I started practicing centering prayer, which was a method of meditation or contemplative prayer that the monks had developed. Basically, it had always been in the Christian tradition, but then kind of got lost after the years of conflict between Protestants and Catholics in the age of Reformation and after that. And then in the 60s, what had happened was the hippies were going around to all different traditions, Hindu ashrams and Zen centers and Taoist centers, and asking, what is your method of meditation? We'd like to learn it. Then they go to the monastery, the Catholic monastery, and say, what is your method? And the monks are like, oh, well, we kind of fall into this silence, but they hadn't really systematically thought about a method for a long time. So some of the monks had developed this method they called centering prayer, based on a medieval work called The Cloud of Unknowing that was written in the 14th century. And it basically was a sense of letting go of one's thoughts and then dropping into one's center, dropping into, they kind of envision it as a sort of an abyss within, and you sort of let yourself rest back into the divine presence who dwells deeply in the canyon within. And I found this really helpful. It helped me lay aside some of my burning questions and find a sense of centeredness. Because as I talked about, I'd had a sense that I was somehow inferior to those around me. And I often found the beauty of the world kind of overwhelming. So what I started to find that there was a beauty of the inner self, that within there was this whole world of that one could explore, that one could adventure into, and that the Christian mystics taught this, that God dwelled within, and that you had to go within to be able to truly find that presence in the world around you and in the people, and to find that true sense of union and that sense of connection. And I found this immensely healing, especially being able to let go of all of my thoughts and rest back into this sort of intuitive knowledge of the divine. Instead of the divine being in front like a screen, it's more like you sink back into your source, into the presence of God. And what I found was that the mystics used all of these landscape images to talk about this inner self and this inner perception of God, which appealed to me immensely, since I grew up in the fields and forests of Pennsylvania, and then I came to forestry school in Colorado. And I found this attraction to the natural world. So some of the landscape images that they would use were the inner desert. For example, Meister Eckhart would talk about the inner desert into which no distinction ever peeped. And a lot of the desert fathers and mothers of the early 3rd through the 6th centuries would talk about, they would go out into the actual deserts of Syria and Egypt and other places in North Africa, in order to get in touch with the presence of God in a special kind of way. That was the early monastic movement. And so there was a lot of talk about the inner desert. So there's a sense of loving, that sense of emptiness and desolation and dryness, because within that, this immense beauty could be found. And I started to explore some of the desert areas, for example, in Red Rock, the Moab area and other areas, and I could see that this desert radiated this kind of spiritual beauty that I could then find within myself. And when I would enter the silence, I would find that inner desert. Indeed, in the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Hosea had said that God told the people, I will lure you into the desert and there I will speak to your heart. And so I started to feel that inner desert, and that the emptiness and the sense of longing, the thirst, was okay, just to sit with it and enjoy it. They also talked a lot about the inner abyss or canyon, that if you went within and dropped your thoughts, it was as though you could keep on dropping into this kind of pleasant abyss where you're surrounded by the presence of God. And they often talked about it at night, as though you're in a canyon at night. So there's a sense of intimacy, sense of being surrounded by the canyon walls, and that it was this kind of interior abyss or interior canyon that was there. They also talked a lot about the dark night of the soul, and they used images of the night sky. And so there was a sense that that within us was this kind of darkness. Why is it dark? It's dark because you're letting go of all of your thoughts and ideas and concepts and feelings in order to get in touch with something, as St. Augustine said, that's closer to you than you are to yourself. So as a result, the usual clarity of having ideas, clear and distinct ideas and insights, starts to dissipate somewhat because you're sinking back into this kind of union with your source that is so close to you, it cannot be seen with concepts, but that one could feel a kind of embrace, just as you were embraced by the canyon walls. And if you're in an old growth forest at night, you can feel embraced by the sequoia or redwood trees that are there. There's a sense of being embraced by this presence that wells up from within and surrounds you. There was also the book, The Cloud of Unknowing. The author of that lived in Britain in an area where the fog from the North Sea would come in and completely surround everything with this fog. And so he developed a method of meditation or contemplative prayer that was the sense of dropping one's thoughts and being surrounded in this obscurity and unknowing and being able to contact this divine presence within that unknowing. I would start to take trips out to the Pacific Northwest, and I would be immersed in that fog and just feel the kind of intimacy of that and realize that was something that was within me as well. Also, there was a lot of talk, so in one of the Desert Fathers, Evagrius Ponticus, he talked about when we dropped our thoughts and enter into the inner presence of God, that it was as though we could see our mind like a sapphire sky. So there was also that sky-like imagery as well. And to realize that the sky that I enjoyed external to me was actually inside as well. And I found there that the dialogue with Tibetan Buddhism was fascinating because there was so much sky imagery there and spaciousness. And if you think of the land of Tibet, where there's so much open sky and the high altitude, I felt a real correspondence to that in my experience of the West and of Colorado. But here it's the inner sky. So also there was a talk about God as the horizon of being, as the theologian Karl Rahner talked about. And so there was this sense, when I was in forestry school, I would hike up a mountain and then I would see another mountain, the next mountain in the distance, and I wanted the view you could get from that. So I would go down, hike down that mountain and go up the next one and go up a series of mountains. So there was a sense that that spiritual truth of the divine is always on that horizon, that beckoning you, into that next realm of spiritual exploration. So there was the horizon within. There was endless places to explore. There's a sense of dropping deep within into the canyon of one's soul and being embraced by God. There was this sense of this sky that one could explore, endless spaciousness within that was also capable of exploration. There was this kind of desert within that where one could feel the beauty of the red rock within, and the red symbolizing passion. During my time at the monastery, so the point here is I started to discover that there's an inner landscape. So it wasn't just that the things I was desiring were out there in landscapes or in people, but that there was an inner landscape, and that was something that I could love, and that my source, that God loved. At the monastery, there was also a sense that they had a very mystical view of the Eucharist. And growing up in a Protestant tradition, I didn't have as much of that. It was just viewed as a purely symbolic kind of thing. But in the monastery, and they invited anyone who wanted to partake of the Eucharist to do so. You didn't have to be Catholic. They said all that needed to be was you had a sense it was this mystery you were partaking of. It wasn't just a symbol. And so in the Catholic Church, there was this sense, just a second, let me just finish this thought. There was this sense that you were taking the presence of Christ that's in this bread within, and the wine, as you feel the wine warm your insides, as you take the bread within, Christ is actually inside, and you can feel that warmth. And the Catholic theologian Teilhard de Chardin said that in the Eucharist, you gain this sense that all of matter is sacred, so that the bread and the wine were just the beginning for seeing that all of matter is actually the body of Christ. So I found this kind of inner perspective of the Christ within just through the physical act of taking the Eucharist. Yes, question.
I'm not Christian, but I think the question was in the Eucharist is taking of the bread and the wine in a Mass service.
Yes, the Eucharist is taking the bread and the wine as the body and blood of Christ. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Except the mystics see it in a kind of spiritual sense, that it's the spiritual presence of Christ, and that who then inhabits all of matter. Because the mystical understanding of Christ is more, as Matthew Fox would talk about, the cosmic Christ, that there is this presence, this calm, radiant warmth that spreads throughout all things. So that everything exists in the presence of Christ, and so it's spread throughout all of creation. So the point for the Christian mystic of Christ dying and resurrecting, the point of the empty tomb symbolically is that Christ leaves one particular place in order to be able to be present everywhere. But has to leave that one particular place so that people stop worshiping the particular in order to find this presence that's everywhere. Because he appears to the disciples afterwards. There's two of them walking on this road, and they're reminiscing about Christ, and they're sad, and the stranger comes among them, and starts talking to them, and asks why they're so sad. And so they say, well, haven't you heard, our teacher died. And so then, of course, what happens is they need to take lodging for the night. So they invite him, and they say, oh, will you come stay with us, in the inn. So he does, and then they go to have a meal. He breaks the bread, and as soon as he breaks the bread, they realize it's Jesus. So he appears in another form, or he appears to Mary Magdalene at the tomb as the gardener. The mystic doesn't say that. It's not just that she mistook that the gardener might have been Christ. Christ actually was the gardener. So he is able to appear in all of these other different forms, and there's other stories as well. So it's the cosmic Christ, it's the Christ who inhabits all of matter. And this was an understanding I got from these Catholic monks, who then would go to seek the presence of God and of Christ in all things. That kind of calm, radiant warmth, that love that would bind all things together. So I began to discover this presence and this beauty and this thing that was lovable within my own sense of self, which I hadn't before. At the same time, I began to realize that the longing I had, as though there was some sort of fulfillment that I needed outside of myself, and that I was lacking, I started to realize that the longing itself was already the very thing I was looking for. Because I started reading some of the mystics, St. Bernard of Clairvaux and others, who said that our longing for the divine, our longing for God, is actually a participation in the longing of God for us. So there's always this kind of mutuality, so that we're always looking for something to come and end the longing, and my longing wouldn't end. I always felt like there was something more that I didn't have. And so I just woke up one day to see that I didn't need anything else. The longing was the answer. That was the answer. That I already had the experience of being longed for in the experience of longing. So it was a very inner kind of experience. Another sense that the beauty that I was seeking was within the human, within the deep self. There was also a sense that the spiritual questions I had were also their own answer. I was always looking for answers that would get rid of the question. And instead, I realized that the question itself was already a divine question. It's as though all of life is the Creator's adventure, and the Creator is seeking to explore all of life and has this question, but we don't hear it verbally because it's too deep to be heard, but instead we hear it within our human heart and mind, so that our questions are actually like an echo of the divine question. So, are you there is really an echo of the Creator saying to us, are you there? To seek to find the depths of yourself. So I started to find this kind of inner landscape that was quite powerful. And it helped give me a center, and I realized that I was just as noble as those natural landscapes and the people that I thought were so amazing growing up, and that it was within me. I also started to realize that Christ wasn't, I talked about the experience of Christ in the Eucharist of within, but even the presence of Christ externally that you might see in an icon or read about in Scripture, that mystic saw that he was actually a mirror of the true self. So that he wasn't just an external out there that was going to save you or do something for you, but that was actually mirroring who you were. So for example, St. Paul had said, as we gaze as in a mirror at the glory of Christ, we are changed into the same image. So it's like as you would gaze at that image, you'd actually become that image. It was like a mirror of who you were inside. So I started to realize as well that that's what the presence of God in the landscape was. It was a mirror of my own inner life, that the beauty I perceived in people was also a mirror of parts of myself that were undiscovered. And so there was this real kind of awareness that the depths were to be found within. Well, that's what happened with me at the monastery. After I left the monastery, I decided I wanted to craft a life to do what the monks were doing. And so I started a janitorial business, and where I could really pray while I was doing simple manual labor, and had a lot of silence and meditation, family time, but a simple lifestyle. Yes, question.
How long were you at the monastery? You went around 23?
Yeah, I was at the monastery. Good question. I actually, so I would go back and forth from home to the monastery, but then Thomas Keating set up a winter-long retreat in 1984. So I spent that winter at the monastery.
84, I didn't catch the first date that you went.
1981, I started.
So
Yeah. So I came home from that deciding I wanted to live as a monk in the world. And at that time, Marcia Sinitar had written a book called Ordinary People as Monks and Mystics, and it was kind of in the air. And so I got real interested in that, and so started trying to live that life of silence, simplicity, study, time in nature, time with family. I remember my daughter, when I asked her when she was a teenager, I have two daughters, I asked her, so what does the contemplative life mean, Crystal? She said, oh, that means that you sit at dinner and you really listen to each other and really ask questions of each other. And I thought, what a great way to look at the contemplative life. In other words, you're finding something sacred in the other person, you know, and you're really there to listen and to find that divine there. And I thought that was really interesting that was the takeaway for her, what the main aspect of a contemplative life was. So after I left the monastery, then I decided to craft this life, and my wife and I were together in it, of this contemplative life. And what I started to find then is that that inner place that I had discovered, that inner canyon, that inner spaciousness, that inner warmth, that was one of the places out of which the Creator creates all things, that they all come out of within. So Meister Eckhart had said, how amazing it is. He says, everything remains within in the depths of the human soul, and yet it appears outside. It appears outside in the world. So I had this sense that the spaciousness that I was encountering as a place that God is emptied into inside was this kind of place that all things were arising out of. Buddhists would call it awareness, right? You have this sense of spacious awareness and everything arises from within that. The Christian would see it as the presence of God, a God who is emptied out in bliss into this spaciousness. And suddenly everything around you arises like an echo out of nowhere. And many of the Christian mystics use that kind of imagery, that everything is a word of God, but that everything is kind of this echo. It's as though the Creator is about to speak this word, but loses himself in bliss, And nevertheless, everything echoes with that unspoken word. I had a vivid experience of this sense of everything arising out of the inner spaciousness or the inner desert and echoing. When we took the family down on a trip to Echo Amphitheater in Georgia O'Keeffe country, I noticed here at the Quaker Meeting House, they had some pictures of Ghost Ranch out in the lobby there. And that's right near where Georgia O'Keeffe lived. In fact, that's the very land on which she lived. So Echo Amphitheater was near there, and it's this fascinating place. So you go off the highway, it's a Forest Service area, and then you hike through several rows of pinyon juniper trees, and then you come to this kind of these concave sandstone, Jurassic era sandstone layered in orange and yellow and beige. It's very beautiful. So you go from the highway, you hike through these trees, and you go right up to the sandstone wall. And the interesting thing is that you can hear echoes of the cars back on the highway, but you can't hear the original sounds. All you hear are these echoes resounding off this wall. And one time when we were camping there, there used to be a campground there. The same thing happened with coyote calls. You could hear echoes of these coyote calls coming off the sandstone wall, but you couldn't hear the original coyotes. Well, that gave me insight into that's what's happening in Christian meditation and contemplative prayer. We have this kind of inner spaciousness and this inner desert that is empty of characteristics. And all things appear, all of your perceptions and thoughts, they appear like echoes as though out of nowhere. And an echo at the root, they have the love word of the Creator, as though the Creator is about to speak this word of love into the world, and loses himself in bliss, and yet everything echoes with this divine love word. So I moved from the place in childhood of finding all of this beauty outside that I had a love affair with, then to finding it inside in this kind of inner landscape, and then realizing that everything is emerging out of this spaciousness that I share with everyone else. So there was a renewed sense that the world was sacred as arising from this place from within. And I found that absolutely amazing that I had this kind of intimacy with all of creation arising out of this divine awareness that is within and this kind of divine canyon. After that, I also started to get in touch with the more horizontal sense of union. So I mentioned how I learned to go within and find a union with God and the inner self in my monastic experience. And so it's that kind of vertical union where you drop within and find the divine presence at your source, and then find all things emerging out of that. But there's also a horizontal union, and that's the sense that everyone around you is divine, but they're divine in their own way. So this uses the image of the body of Christ, and it's so necessary in our time, because everybody can find their own inner union, but if it doesn't spread out to the world till we find the sacredness of everything around us, we're not going to be able to have the energy to help transform the world. So St. Paul uses an interesting image of the body of Christ. He says that one person is like a hand, that they specialize in works of service. Another person maybe is an eye, they specialize in having a vision. Another person is like a foot. They like to get things done. So each person is like a different aspect of this body. And he says, well, can the hand say to the eye, I don't need you? And can the eye say to the foot, I don't need you? He says, well, no, you need them all. Well, maybe Paul was thinking about that image in terms of Christians, people who profess themselves as Christians. But Origen of Alexandria, who was a 3rd century theologian from Egypt, said, no, actually the body of Christ extends throughout all of creation. Says that Christ has the whole creation as his body. So there's this kind of horizontal union then, where there is a sense that everything around us is a different aspect of the true self. So my monastic experience was that the true self is grounded in God, and there's a sense of centeredness and a sense that that's all you need because everything is arising out of that. But there's a second sense of the self, and that is that it's an interconnecting, it's a body, or it's this kind of web of presences, and that we're incomplete without all of those other aspects of the whole. I started to experience this as the divine feminine. That is that sense of the divine in the immanent world, and that is more of a flow that moves between all of the different aspects of life, connecting them all together, and that gives a sense that all of the different pieces are needed to complete the whole. We hear the web of life, or the spider, the spider woman in some of the Southwest traditions. We hear the net of Indra in the Buddhist tradition, where you've got this web, and there's a jewel in the node of the knot of every in that web, and every jewel reflects every other jewel. And so I started to have more of that sense. So after going within and then finding things coming from within, then also realizing, oh, well, everything else has its own special way of being divine, and I'm incomplete without those. And so it wasn't a bad thing to not have it all together yourself, because you realize, well, that means that you need the divine in someone else, and in someone else, and in another aspect of nature. And what really started to help me with this was I started to return to my Quaker roots. So I'd grown up a Baptist. There were Quaker roots there, but my mom actually tried to discourage it because she didn't like the teaching about the inner Christ. But then I was schooled in Catholic mysticism, which emphasized that kind of the divine presence within. And I then started to get in touch with my Quaker roots, which was that you would find the divine in everything around you. So George Fox, who started the Friends, the Society of Friends in the 16th century, he told his disciples, he said, travel throughout the land seeking to answer to that of God in everyone. So there's a sense that you're not going to go bringing God to people, you're going to answer to the God who's already there. And another mystic at this time that I got really interested in, his name was Howard Thurman. So Howard Thurman was the spiritual advisor to Martin Luther King Jr., and he kind of represented the mystical wing of the civil rights movement. And Howard Thurman was a person who grew up in the Deep South in Florida in the segregation era, and he had to find the sacredness within to be able to deal with the prejudice and the segregation and all of the bias that he experienced. So he became a mystic. Well, later in life, he took some courses in a college that was 2 miles from my home, Haverford College in Pennsylvania, and really got steeped in the Quaker spirituality. And the interesting thing now is that most of Howard Thurman's works are published by Quaker publishing houses. So Howard Thurman had talked about, he'd said, when you move down into the silence, and of course Quakers talk about centering down, when you move down into your deep center, he says, it's like you hit an aquifer where you come up inside every other, it's like you go down into your inner well, you hit the aquifer and come up inside every other well. So there's a sense of connectedness there, horizontally through that kind of underground aquifer. So through my reconnecting to my Quaker roots, I started to become more aware of the God in everyone around me. That is an aspect of God that I may not have, that I need, who's from someone else. So a person from another individual, another personality type, another gender, a person of another sexual orientation, another race, another nationality, another philosophy, another religion. Those are all pieces of the divine self. Thich Nhat Hanh would call it interbeing, right? There's that sense that everything is connected. The Christian image is the body of Christ. It's that each is a different part of this body, and you need each to be able to complete the whole. So I started to realize that all of those people and landscapes that I felt a longing for, I felt that I wasn't good enough for. They were actually part of this multidimensional horizontal self that spread throughout all of creation. And so there was this increased interest I found in realizing that as I listened to others and heard their perspectives and listened to landscapes and practiced the deep silence that I learned in the monastery, that the sacredness in each of those people, in each culture, in each person that I came in contact with, in each landscape would be enhanced and would express itself to me and would provide me with a divine word. Because this is a part of the contemplative life, is that everything is a word of God. And so the Quaker roots helped put me back in touch for myself with the divine feminine. I also started to study more about the Sophianic dimension, Sophia being the divine feminine in the Christian tradition. And that it's a she that's at the root of every insight. You have every aha experience. People talk about when you're thinking and you have insights, oh, stop being in your head, and I don't know what they're talking about. Because whenever you have an insight, it excites you, right? It excites your body, it excites your emotions. And so it's the presence of Sophia coming and bringing that insight alive to you, the sacred feminine. So, so this was another aspect to my journey, and I wanted to just mention a couple more aspects before I open it up for questions. I started to come more into contact after I went to graduate school at Iliff School of Theology. Well, I started to encounter more and more people who were spiritual but not religious. They were on the Gallup polls. They're considered nuns, N-O-N-E-S, that don't identify with any one religious tradition, and that often, and it's a movement that's really occurring in our time. Sometimes I wonder, what is the future of religion? I think it might be this, and I think a lot of people in the millennial generation and I generation have this kind of perspective that there's this piecing together of insights from all different kinds of places, and that there isn't any one institutional religion or faith that it encapsulates it all. So interestingly, I got in touch, it's interesting how the divine works. I got in touch in seminary with a wing of the Anabaptist movement. They were a movement, and some of them were mystics. I grew up in Pennsylvania, so Pennsylvania was this sort of hotbed for egalitarian spirituality. That is, for spirituality where each person is an aspect of the divine. And I started to reconnect with that with the Quakers. The teaching is expressed, they call it the priesthood of all believers. In other words, there's no special class of priests or religious, everybody is a priest. And of course, the Quakers, the friends who meet in this meeting, everybody is a priest. When they feel led to speak from the Spirit, they stand up and speak in the meeting and then sit down again. I discovered that in the area of Pennsylvania where I was, so there were a lot of some Mennonites and Amish, and they came from the Anabaptist movement, which was from the 16th century, and they carried on the teaching, the radical Reformation teaching that every person is a priest. And of course, they did it in community. But there was a mystical wing of that movement of Anabaptists. Others were the Shakers who lived in community, who saw the divine in each other as well, who were an offshoot from the Quakers. So Pennsylvania was this place where all these egalitarian spiritual groups were. There was yes?
Is that the mystical wing, the Shakers?
The Shakers are, they have a mysticism to them as well.
That's not the mystical wing.
No, I'm getting to it, yeah. The mystical wing of the Anabaptists called the contemplative spirituals. And so they, interestingly, they settled, many of them were German, they settled right in the area where I grew up, and I didn't know about them. Sebastian Franck was one of those teachers, and Caspar Schwenkfeld. There was a Schwenkfelder church right there a few miles from where I live that I didn't even know about. So I started to reconnect with this movement, and basically what it's called is the invisible church movement. So they believe that any group of people eventually gets power dynamics to it and gets a certain corruptness to it. So they believed in the principle where Jesus said, he said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, like here tonight, there I am in their midst. There I am in their midst. So Sebastian Frank and Caspar Schwenkfeld said that church really isn't organized in space, that is like everybody together in one place. Maybe it's more of this kind of, this sort of online community that we're experiencing these days. It's more a function of time. So Rufus Jones, who was a Quaker theologian who worked at Haverford College right near my house, who researched this, because the Quakers came directly from the contemplative spirituals. That's the mystical wing of the Anabaptists, who also produced the Amish and the Mennonites and the Hutterites. Rufus Jones said that Sebastian Frank was a Heraclitus of the spirit. And so Heraclitus was the Greek philosopher who said, anybody remember what his most famous quote was? You never step into the same river twice. Okay, so the contemplative spirituals, the German contemplative spirituals of the 16th century, said that's what church or Christian community, or today we'd say the Sangha, or the sacred community is. It's more a function of time. So that means that, okay, so we might meet in this room and we'll have some interaction in a minute. So that's an instance of church. Then we'll go home and we'll talk to our partner, our family, and have a meaningful conversation. That's an instance of church. Then we'll get up in the morning, we'll watch the sunrise and have a meaningful experience of that. That's church. Then we'll go talk to our neighbor and have a meaningful conversation. That's church. And so it continues throughout the day. So instead of meeting in any one place, it is like a river that flows through it all. So there's a sense among the contemplative spirituals that somebody asks you, well, oh, what church do you go to, or what is your religion? If you point to something outside the person who's asking you the question, it's like you're dissing that person, because they are your community and church in that very moment. So that was fascinating to me, because since there's such a movement of people now, especially young people, who don't find this community in any one place necessarily, but they might find it spread out through all of these different interactions, that I actually had this tradition within my own Christian tradition, the contemplative spirituals, who talked about that. And Sebastian Frank, for the time, he said, well, they don't have to be a Christian. He said anybody who's a sincere seeker is a part of this community. And he said that includes Turks. Of course, they would have been Muslim at the time. He says that includes pagans. And of course, he was hounded. The other Protestants hated him. So he had to move his entire life, because they would try to run him out of town, because he was basically saying the presence of Christ is spread throughout the world and isn't confined to Christians. But anyway, when I came in contact with this tradition of the contemplative spirituals of the invisible church, of a community that's more a function of time than necessarily a place, all gathering in one place, I got really excited. So it was another dimension to falling in love with the world, to finding that the divine could appear at any moment with the next connection, and then the next, and then the next. Could be an animal, a bird, a landscape, a sunset, a person from this tradition, that tradition. It didn't matter. So I found that very exciting, and it added a new dimension to the mysticism that I had discovered in all of the other aspects of my spiritual journey.